3 people, 3 disappearances, and 3 wild places. Each one a mystery that seemed unsolvable. But the wilderness has this way of revealing its secrets, and sometimes the answers are just waiting to be found years later, when most of the world has forgotten. Let's dive into these true stories where wild secrets were kept until finally they were revealed. This is Red Rum, a series of unfortunate events. These bonus episodes are just like your usual weekly episodes of Red Rum, but shorter. So you'll usually get 3 stories that all have a similar theme. This story is about one of the most haunting expeditions ever. In 1845, there was this explorer called John Franklin, and he set out with 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. John had years of Arctic experience. He was really well versed in how to plan and how to execute a plan. But this was not just any mission. This was the big expedition to finally crack the code on the Northwest Passage. It's the sea route through the Arctic, and it had basically just stumped explorers for centuries. John was a respected veteran. He was known for his resilience, and this was going to be his most incredible achievement to date. John's ships were the best of the best. They were state of the art. They were basically reinforced to survive the icy storms and weather, and they also had supplies of food for up to 3 years. They were loaded with everything from books to cutlery to literally barrels of food. Essentially, it was this kind of small self-sufficient world. And what I found most scary about this, and what is really hard to kind of imagine now with my 2024 brain, is that he and his team were literally going into the unknown. They had no idea what was out there. They left England in high spirits, and eventually they reached the Arctic, but that is when things took a dark turn. And I should say that all of this information is both from what scientists have pieced together, and it's also based on something that was found that we will talk about. It was a quite haunting note. So the 2 ships, the Erebus and the Terror, they're on their way through, they're in the ocean, and they get trapped in ice, frozen solid. They think they might just be there for a little while, but they are there for months, maybe even years. Imagine the cabin fever of that, just the monotony of each day, one into the next. And on top of that, that creeping cold, the kind that really chills you to the bone, just hoping for some kind of rescue. Now, as the time ticked on, sickness started to infect everyone, morale plummeted, and stocks of food and other supplies were running low. Things are just going from bad to worse. Meanwhile, back in England, John's family, his colleagues, they had started to worry. And as the year went by with no word, the government did actually send out some search teams to try and find these men. People desperately wanted to believe that John and his crew were alive. But by 1948, when even the search parties were returning empty-handed, they really had to face the truth that John, his expedition was lost, and he and all of his crew were likely dead. But here is where the mystery really deepens. Over the years, as search missions did continue through the Arctic, they started finding really quite eerie clues. One of the first was this tiny piece of paper. It was weathered, it was worn. It was discovered by searchers in 1859, and it had been tucked between these little stones on an island. To this day, it is the only first-hand written account that we have of what actually happened to the men when they disappeared. Here's the wild part though. That note, there are 2 messages written on it, and they are months apart, and each of them tells a progressively very different story. The first part is written in May 1847, and it's surprisingly upbeat. It's saying that things are going well on the expedition, and although the ships were stuck in ice for the moment, everyone was happy, everyone was healthy. It sounded kind of optimistic, like they really believed that if they could just wait this out, they would eventually be able to keep moving. But then there is the second message, and it's actually just scribbled round the margins, and it's dated 1848. And this tone completely changes. It is more like a cry for help. And the note now mentions that at this time, John has died, along with 24 other crew members. Now, By this time of writing, the ships had been locked in that ice for over a year and a half, and things had gone from hopeful to desperate. It says that the remaining crew, there were about 105 men at this point, they had finally decided to abandon ship and just make their way south on foot. Now, what I hadn't mentioned is that the food supplies that the men had, they were contained in these cans, but they were lead-lined cans. What they didn't know back then was that lead is poisonous. And so even the food they were able to eat was poisoning them. The thought of these men weakened and poisoned by lead, starving, trying to haul what little they could, trying to haul all of their belongings across the frozen Arctic wasteland, that in itself is haunting. They knew they were in a fight for their lives and the odds were massively stacked against them. The note, the kind of margin note, ends with this grim detail, quote, "They died in different places along the line." The horror and the magnitude of this is really, really clear. That paper is like this kind of ghostly voice from the past. You can almost feel their desperation, the dwindling hope through the paper. It's also, I think, a kind of stark reminder about how isolated and vulnerable they were out there. It was over a century later that researchers finally found the wrecks of the two ships, the Erebus and the Terror. They had just kind of been preserved there at the bottom of the ocean in the icy depths. When scientists began to piece together the evidence, they realised that the crew had gone through something pretty nightmarish. Imagine running out of food, being isolated in these freezing temperatures, and on top of that, these lead-lined cans that were meant to sustain them actually ended up poisoning them. And then in their final desperate days, some of them turned to cannibalism to survive. There were cut marks from blades that were later found on some of the bones, and these were seen as signs of cannibalism. Evidence suggested that a combination of cold, starvation, disease including scurvy and pneumonia, these were all made worse by, of course, the poisoning. A combination of these things killed every single person on that expedition. It's a horrifying thought, but it gives just a glimpse into how extreme their situation had become. John was one of the best prepared and most highly regarded expeditionists of his time, and yet the Arctic won. Today, the wrecks of those two ships, Erebus and Terror, are historic sites. A group of hikers one day stumbled across this lone bike, and it was fully loaded up with camping gear, but it had been abandoned on this remote part of this thick forest in Olympic National Park. The spring rains were just starting, so it made the air feel really heavy, really cold, and just eerily still. There were no tracks nearby, there was no sign of anyone, there was just the empty bike and the forest. Now, when those hikers first stumbled across that bike in 2017, they figured that someone had probably just wandered off, maybe the rider was nearby exploring a trail. But when 34-year-old Jacob Gray was reported as missing, they began to wonder what had happened to him. Jacob was a seasoned outdoors person. He had come prepared for the wild, but somehow he'd just disappeared. It was on one April afternoon that Jacob decided to go out on his bike as usual. He packed it up with all of his camping gear and he headed out into Olympic National Park in Washington. Jacob's journey started like any other for him. He pedaled up into the park and kept riding through these winding trails. The Pacific Northwest in springtime can be beautiful, but it's also reported as being unpredictable. There might be grey skies and really chilling rain and winds, that kind of cold that seeps into your bones. And so when his bike was found abandoned and he was nowhere in sight, it was very, very odd, and it was as though he had just vanished into the wilderness without a trace. Now, later that evening, another group of hikers came across Jacob's bike by the river, and they also noticed that it had bags strapped onto it. It was loaded with all of the camping essentials, but there was no one around. And so Jacob's family was notified almost immediately. His dad, Randy, flew up to Washington and he spent days in that local area just kind of searching around. He went with search teams and he combed through every possible place that they thought Jacob might have walked. But after weeks of searching, there was still nothing, no sign of Jacob. There was no gear, no tracks, and of course not Jacob himself. The days turned to weeks, and the family were devastated, but they refused to give up hope. In fact, Randy had returned home briefly, but he just couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to be out there looking for his son. As far as he was concerned, Jacob was still alive. But before long, Jacob's case just became another one of those outdoor mysteries, the kind of story of a man who went into the wilderness and never came back. Weeks and months passed, and it seemed that the world had kind of started to move on, but his family never truly believed that Jacob was gone. Fast forward nearly a year later and something changed. It was in August of 2018 that a group of backpackers were trekking through Olympic National Park. They ended up going to this secluded, kind of hard to reach area. It was almost never travelled. And as they entered that area, they stumbled across a skeleton just underneath some rocks. Now, there was no question to them, it was a human body. And there were small remnants of gear, different kinds of clothing, and eventually they found some ID, and it confirmed that it was Jacob. Investigators pieced together that Jacob had likely succumbed to exposure, but there was more to this story than just that. It appeared that Jacob had survived for days, possibly even weeks, and he ventured deeper and deeper into the forest and became weaker and weaker. He'd sought shelter in this area, perhaps trying to get out of the cold weather, and in the cold, he had then likely curled up underneath those rocks to try and get some kind of warmth. In a heartbreaking revelation, it turned out that Jacob had been very close to being found a number of times, but he was very just out of reach. Months after the initial search, a hiker had been on his way back through the park and he had reported some strange sounds coming from an area of the woods. At the time, he thought it might be someone in distress, and so he went to investigate and searchers arrived to join him. But by the time they all got there was no one around and the sounds had kind of stopped. They didn't know it at the time, but Jacob had likely been close enough for his voice or his struggles to have been heard. He might have been within reach, but the vastness of the forest and the fact that he was already far too weak to actually call out for help, that may have kept him out of sight. In fact, for the following year, Jacob's body, at least, was close to being found several times. A search team was on the trail one winter when they stumbled across this area that was a little bit suspicious. It was almost too well hidden and it was covered in this kind of thick undergrowth. But once again, they missed the mark. No one knew that they were walking right past where Jacob's body would eventually be found. They were literally just meters away. It wasn't until the summer of 2018, so this is more than a year after Jacob had vanished, that group of backpackers, completely unrelated to any of the search efforts that had been going on, they did eventually come across Jacob's remains. The area that they ventured to was a very remote spot and people didn't tend to go there because it just had this really difficult terrain. It wasn't a nice hiking trail. Jacob's final location was not far from where the search team had concentrated their efforts, but they were always just a little bit far away from him. And so despite being nearly found a number of times, ultimately he succumbed to the elements, just unable to make it out in time. This final story is about two men who were not your typical adventurers. Their names were John Fairfax and Richard Mahay, and they were driven by this sense of kind of restless ambition. They were the kind of people who didn't just dream about exploring the whole world, they actually did it. Their decision, however, to row down the Amazon River in 1970 was not a small one. It was the culmination of years of feats and this kind of shared, I guess, obsession with the unknown. For John in particular, obsession was in his blood. He was no stranger to the extreme, and in fact, he'd already made himself quite a name by becoming the first person to row across the Atlantic solo. He'd done this just 1 year earlier, and his journey was really of pure willpower. The tasks that he faced meant that he had major exhaustion. He had to figure out how to deal with storms, and he did this over a 5,000-mile voyage. The world record made John extremely well known in newspapers at the time and in the media, but he decided he wasn't done there. For him, this was just the start, and he was drawn to the idea of taking on the Amazon, the most dangerous, unexplored areas on Earth. He saw it as the next big challenge, the kind of ultimate, test of human endurance. He would later say that it was his personal Everest. Now, John's companion Richard wasn't as famous, but he was just as passionate about pushing his limits. He was a skilled boatsman and he was incredibly outdoorsy, so he was really no stranger to life in the wild. When John pitched the idea of navigating the Amazon, Richard did not hesitate. Together, they made plans, they gathered up all of their supplies, and they set out to conquer this thing that few people had ever even tried to attempt. They were absolutely sure that they would be able to do it. Their journey to make that happen, though, was not easy. The Amazon wasn't exactly welcoming, and to prepare for such an enormous task, they really had to source a number of things. They had to get the right equipment, canoes that could withstand these huge, unforgiving rapids. They needed maps. They needed enough provisions for the long haul, really. I mean, these logistics are enough to put most people off, but for Richard and John, it really didn't. They just wanted to explore the Amazon, and they didn't want to just prove that they could survive this. They wanted people to know that they could take on nature's greatest challenge and they could really come out on top. Now, once they were in the Amazon, the challenge became clear. This was harder than they'd ever imagined. The jungle was incredibly dense, and the river itself had completely unpredictable currents. And on top of this, they dealt with this suffocating heat quite constantly. But the danger wasn't just from the elements. The Amazon reportedly is a place that really is unforgiving. The slightest misstep can cost you everything. Their journey started with hope, but as they ventured into the wilderness, the harsh reality of the Amazon set in. Supplies began to dwindle, fatigue crept in, and the river really turned on them at one point. They faced these kind of torrential storms and currents that every turn that they made, it just threatened to capsize them. Still, they weren't going to give up. They pressed on, and they were driven by the absolute belief that they could conquer the impossible. Now, as the pair paddled deeper into the Amazon, they encountered this massive storm that sort of came out of nowhere. The rain had started coming down in downpours, which made their visibility almost none. And it whipped up these violent winds that made everything, including the river's current, just so much harder to deal with. In all of this chaos, the men's boat was nearly overturned by the surging currents, and they struggled to stay together as the river just kind of tossed them around. In the storm's peak intensity, the rapid waters surged so unexpectedly and caught them completely off guard. And in this storm, even the sound was so loud, they even struggled to hear each other. No matter that they were super close to each other, they just couldn't communicate well, which of course was essential for their survival. This was proving to be almost impossible. As they fought to stay afloat, the storm finally overwhelmed them, and there was some confusion and just the fury of the river. It meant that there was this huge kind of wave, and it separated the men. Now, John finally emerged. He was exhausted. He was in a state of shock. And when he looked around, he realised that Richard was gone. He started frantically searching for his friend, but he was nowhere to be seen. By all accounts, he had disappeared without a trace. When John returned to civilization, he did get a search party launched, but no sign of Richard was ever found again. It's believed that he was likely swept up by the fast currents, or possibly even that he succumbed to the many, many dangers of the Amazon itself. It could have been from drowning. It could have also been from wildlife, or even just being lost in this kind of dense, disorientating jungle. The tragic and semi-mysterious disappearance has left many questions unanswered. And John never fully recovered from the loss of his friend, of course. The storm and Richard's disappearance served as a harsh reminder that the Amazon challenges even the most experienced adventurers. And it's a grim reminder of just how unforgiving the wild can be. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Red Rum. As always, I have a recommendation for you this week. It is a TV series called Silo. It's this science fiction dystopia series, so it's a bit different to my normal ones, but it is one that I was recommended and I'm so glad that I watched it. The second season comes out for us this week in the UK, so I assume that'll be the same in the US. It's an American series set in this dystopian future, and it's all contained within this giant silo, hence the name. There's about 10,000 people inside it, and you can't go outside or you'll die, or at least that's what the kind of leaders would have you believe. It stars Rebecca Ferguson as this engineer who's kind of the protagonist of the whole thing. It really brings you into this world, and if you like stuff like this, like dystopian-esque, then you probably will really love it. It reminds me a little bit of Snowpiercer. I really enjoyed that. I watched the TV series ages ago, and then I watched the film more recently. And it was the first time I think that I realised how much I like this stuff. Although kind of in a different world, but sort of a similar vein. One of my favourite TV shows is The Prisoner, which is a 1960s TV show about this man trapped on an island, basically. It's very nostalgic for me. Me and my dad used to watch it every Sunday. It's very interesting, but it's definitely a bit more old school. I'd really encourage, if you like to watch kind of bizarre, weird things, I guess, it's kind of like a surreal happening, then you might enjoy that. It also stars Patrick McGoohan, who is a brilliant actor. I don't actually know where you'd watch it now. I guess it probably is on YouTube. I'll maybe try and find it and link it below if I can. If you watch The Prisoner or Silo, please let me know what you think. I think Silo is definitely more mainstream, but to be honest, both of them have their own nuances, and I just think they're really good. Other than that, I will see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.